it up.
Oh, you done it. Up.
No, because I wanted to.
This is me. Hi, we're live.
You're live.
That's okay. Nobody's on yet. It's okay. It takes a minute. It takes a minute for everybody to
Okay.
log on. Hi. Hello, everybody. Welcome in. Sorry, we're slightly delayed. Technical difficulties and all. So thank you so much for joining.
It's the ghost.
It's
Always the ghost.
So, my name is Dina. I'm co-owner of Amityville Apothecary. Danielle, say hey from the netherworld.
Hey, from the netherworld.
So here we are at the Athenaeum at Amityville Apothecary, our dedicated bookshop, and we are here with Leanna Hieber. Do you want me to say your full government name?
You can.
Leanna Renée.
There's a spiritual ghostly reason why I use all three names. We can talk about that in a minute. But there is actually the spirit world demanded that I use all three names. It was very clear about it. So
who am I to get in the way of spirit? So this is going to be a little bit different than our format. So wanted to come on and introduce myself and introduce Leanna to everybody. And we're going to have a wonderful conversation about haunted history, but from the perspective of our female ghosts, because you know what? We deserve equality in all things and even hauntings. That is for sure. So without further ado,
thank you, my friend.
Enjoy.
I'm so glad to be here. Thanks, everyone. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about this book, how it came to be, tell you a couple of my favorite ghost stories, and then I'm also going to talk a little bit in sort of a workshop capacity, a little bit about psychic shielding, because when you work in haunted spaces, when you work in different types of energy spaces, sometimes you might want to just shake things off if you're in a place that doesn't feel right, or even just in a place that feels really overwhelming, or even in a place that where you're really, really energetic. You might just kind of want to guard your own energy. And this is a question that I get a lot. I'm a ghost tour guide as well as an author. So I'm a performer. I work with Burrows of the Dead, New York City's top ghost tour company, founded by my co-author, Andrea Janes. And so when this book came to be, there was a lot of research that we had to do in haunted spaces. So a lot of the types of back and forth that we have with our customers, a lot of times are wanting to know about what we think about hauntings. What do we think about the spirit world? What do we think? Do we think that it's real? Now, we're not here with this book to tell you what to think. It's very important that we not tell you what to think, because the spirit world, the paranormal, ghost stories, all of these things are very subjective. They're very personal. When you start talking about a spectral encounter, it is a very intimate thing. A lot of times for people who have had a ghostly experience, it might be a relative, it might be a loved one. Ghosts are of us. We could be them. They are something that is not as easily put aside as, say, another creature within the paranormal realm. It's a little easier to have a little bit of distance with a vampire story or a werewolf story. But when you talk about a ghost story, that is of us and with our people and possibly our loved ones, interacting in spaces that are historically haunted. So how did this book come to be? So I mentioned I'm a ghost tour guide for Burrows of the Dead. Again, Andrea founded the company 10 years ago, and her and I met at a ghost story telling party in Brooklyn over, a really wonderful bar that was candlelit, and the atmosphere was really wonderful. And we each told our own ghost story and talked about something that is our foremost core belief, which is that we want to lead with respect for the dead when we are telling ghost stories, because again, they are people. It's not an abstraction. It's not, I don't like the phrase ghost hunting personally, because that is disrespectful. We don't hunt people. So that for me is respect for the dead should be first and foremost. So we wanted to do that in even just interactions with talking about a casual ghost story, let alone putting it into print, let alone as we walk the streets of New York City and tell these haunted tales that have been passed down through us, that have been printed in the New York Times, in some cases for decades, if not hundreds of years, that have been put into print. So I was on a ghost tour after starting my work with Burrows of the Dead. Andrea and I had met. We definitely really hit it off. The same kind of perspective that we wanted to lead with our ghost tours was that history, real history, was at the core. Because a lot of times with ghost tours, the focus is on the entertainment angle and on the scary story idea, and a lot of the history and the actual facts of the history of buildings and the people that lived there. A lot of times people will be a little running roughshod over the history. And that's why Andrea founded Bros the Dead, was because she wanted there to be an actual real historical focus. And then the paranormal comes into that. And the paranormal is how that past becomes present. Because those hauntings, they're haunting us. They are in our moment. We are experiencing them one way or another in all the various ways that people do or don't interact with the paranormal. It's fine. You can read this book if you're a skeptic. We welcome you. Again, we're not here to tell you what to think. We're just here to share some uncanny stuff, and in some cases, to myth bust. In some cases, we're here to be like, hey, you heard a lot of lies about this lady, and we got to correct that. Because people like to say a lot of stuff about women. And that has been the case since the dawn of time. So we're here to kind of say, all right, let's set the record straight about some things. So I've been working for Bros the Dead for 9 years, and I've written 16 books of fiction. And so an editor who's familiar with all of my fiction, and by the way, there's ghosts in all my fiction too. I really like ghosts, y'all. So there's ghosts in all my fictions. Everything I do, I dress like this is my clothes. If you like my clothes, you like my books. I dress like I write. I'm a goth. This is what we do. I literally was called to do this. I tried to figure out what career path can I take to dress like this as my uniform. Yeah. So I found it. It's what we do. So here I am leading a ghost tour, being my somewhat chaotic frenetic self, but being really passionate about ghosts. Okay. So that's the through line here. So as I wander down my little pathways of my neural pathways here, I'll get back to what I was actually saying, which was, how did this book start? Yeah. So this editor for a publishing house, New York City, the home of publishing, and I love traditional publishing with a house. I have massive respect for independent publishing, but I do not have good management skills, so I cannot actually do my own thing as an independent publisher. So I really do rely on a house and an editor and a business to keep me organized. So here I am on the streets of New York talking about one of my favorite ghost stories, which had to do with a building that I actually have. And when I say favorite, I mean I hate this building actually, because it's really intense and I have this really visceral reaction. So it's sort of my favorite because I have such a personal reaction to it, but it's not my favorite in that it actually makes me sick. So we'll talk about that in a second. It's 14 West 10th Street, by the way, FYI. The editor who's taking this tour and watching me just freak out in a good way about how much I love telling these stories. She's like, I love your fiction and I love all the ghosts in your fiction, but we really need to talk about the real ghosts. We really need to be doing like a nonfiction book about, at this point, it was just sort of New York City ghosts. And so I said, okay, great. If you like how I'm talking about these things, please let me bring in the woman, the reason for the season, the lady who is the reason why I'm doing this in the first place. So I said, hey, Andrea, let's do a ghost book. Let's actually put what we are practicing on the streets of New York, practice what we preach in actual print. And she had just done, that year, she had just launched a Ghostly Women of Greenwich Village tour, which was the first ghost tour to just focus on the women's stories for Women's History Month in March. And it was a really great response. And press covered it. The New York Times covered it. All this great focus on why are women and ghosts entwined? Women and death have been entwined, whether it's dying in childbirth or infant mortality rates through history, whether it is women traditionally laying out bodies at wakes and being the ones who would care for the body of a past loved one. That's usually been women's work, traditionally. And also women have a long history of writing some of the best ghost stories, especially through the 19th century. So many of our famous ghost lore stories were written and cultivated by women, and ghost stories are sort of an oral tradition. So there is an interesting way in which women and ghost stories have been conflated and entwined through history. So we focus on that. And so when we published with Kensington, our publishing house said, we love your New York City focus, but we really do want this to have a countrywide appeal. So are there other spaces around this incredible, diverse nation that you would feel called to write about. And so we thought, absolutely. I definitely had some really incredible experiences of my own in, say, the Hotel del Coronado out in California, in Salem, where I have family, and so in Ohio, where I'm from, in Minnesota, where I worked for a long time as a ghost tour guide out there too. So there's these really wonderful spots that we chose. Now, obviously, you can tell by the size of this book, this is not an encyclopedia of every female ghost that is a part of that has been tracked down. That was not our mission. That was not our directive. We chose the women who really spoke to us, who literally haunted us. The ones who would keep us up at night with their stories, and also ones that had a bit of a paper trail, because ghost lore is very ephemeral. There's a lot of, so we heard this one story from this one person, and there's not a lot to track in terms of where they lived, records of their existence as people. Because here was the thing. Ghost lore for me is not complete if you don't know something about the person as they lived. So this is real history, real women, real ghosts, and it is completely focusing on these women's lives. And then we tell the spooky stuff that's happened in the spaces that they inhabited after their passing, at the concept of what are their real lives? Because in a lot of cases, some women had stories told about them before they even passed away, that were ghost stories told about the old woman who was living on 4th Street in the Merchant's House Museum. Gertrude Treadwell, spinster, 93 years. She lived on West 4th Street, where all the rest of her neighbors had gone uptown to finer places, and here she was. At that point, by the time that she died, she'd born in the 1840s and died in the 1930s. What a radically wild, different place New York City was. She was just off the Bowery, and that was real rowdy at that point. And here she was, this sort of Miss Havisham type of person who had outlived her time in this way, the only person surviving out of her family that lives in the Merchant's House, and she's in her spirit stayed there still. Whether it's the house remembering her or whether she's remembering the house, we don't really know, but she stayed on in this house. And that was a choice. Even after her father passed away in that house, she would have helped care for him in his wake, as I'd mentioned too. Again, women being part of the life and death cycle. She could have gone off, she could have made another choice, but she decided to stay in this house and keep it exactly as Papa would have liked it, which is maybe a little creepy, but it's kept in the 1870s. It's kept exactly as if it's a time capsule from the 1870s. She died in the 1930s. So here's this really great place that can make a museum immediately, and that's exactly what happened. It was an unbroken line from when Gertrude Treadwell was living in this house to when it became a museum, and then she became a spirit in this house. And so in this regard, ghost stories were told about her before she had passed, because she was this old lady haunting this house. So the book is broken down into sections, and she's in our spinsters and widows section. Why are we so afraid of women alone? There's so many widow ghost stories. What is it about women alone that we feel like we have to create a story around? Now, for Gertrude, this is just her house. And so sometimes she just doesn't want to be disturbed. I mean, she was a lady that did host lots of parties back in the day. So my favorite of the ghost stories of Gertrude is there was a day when a gentleman who was coming to the museum, again, it opened in the 1930s as a museum within a year and a half or so of her passing. And so a few decades back, there's a gentleman who's going to walk up the stairs, and he's ready to go into the museum to see it, to see this time capsule from the 1870s. And he rings the bell. You have to go up the stoop, ring the bell for admittance. And as he does, there's a woman all in Victorian black. She's actually in brown. She's in Victorian brown gown, like a taffeta gown, very specific look, very specific style. And this woman opens the door and she says, "I'm so sorry, we're not accepting visitors today," and closes the door on him. And you think, okay, all right, I didn't know that they were not open. The website said otherwise. All right. So he comes back the next day and he rings the bell again. And a woman in jeans and a polo shirt answers the door. And she says, "Welcome to the Merchant's House." And he said, "Oh, I'm so glad you're open. The lady yesterday, there must have been an event. She was in costume. She said we're not accepting visitors." And the docent said, "We were open yesterday, and we don't wear costumes. Okay. So gentleman's a little nervous, and she's like, "Come on in. Let's get you in here. We'll see the museum." I don't know what happened yesterday, but okay. And so he comes in and he stops because he sees a picture of Gertrude Treadwell, and she's a striking lady. And there's her portrait right inside in an oval frame, and he goes white as a ghost and says, "That's the woman that opened the door. That's the woman that opened the door." And at this point, the docent is wondering if this guy is messing with her. And so she's like, "Tell me about this dress. What was, because ghost lore about Gertrude, like I said, had started circulating before she'd even passed away. So this was a ready-made ghost story for this house. So again, it was primed for it. So she asks more questions about the house and about the dress. And he describes it. And she goes into the back storage and pulls out the exact dress that he has described, which has never been on display to the public. But it was one of hers. It was one of Gertrude's dresses. And there it was. So sometimes Gertrude just does not want to be disturbed. And so we just have to respect that. As guides who take people to her house, we just have to respect that sometimes the lady does not want to be disturbed. And that's the interesting thing for us about ghost lore. Because again, ghosts are people. And so much like us, they too have boundaries sometimes. Sometimes they want to be left alone. And sometimes they're very particular about how they're going to interact with you in the living, in this time, in this space, which is not the same for them. Time and space is different for a spirit than it is for us. And we're just here trying to figure out, all right, well, at what point has your time and space as a spirit interacted with our time and space as a spirit? And even if that's actual, even if it is proven later to be completely bull, sometimes there's still an important aspect in, well, why did this story get started in the first place? So through the sections of this book, we start with different stereotypes that women have been shunted into through life, because sometimes those stereotypes then affected how we would talk about their ghost stories. So we start with Death and the Maiden, and we start with a quote from Edgar Allan Poe. He's here on my pin, the literary love of my life, my literary boyfriend, Edgar Allan Poe. And so we start with Death and the Maiden. Why are we drawn to this concept of the death of a beautiful woman? Poe said, and I'm going to paraphrase Poe here, so sorry, Edgar. The death of a beautiful woman is the most poetical topic in the world. Now, he didn't mean that flippantly. He meant that in the fact that that was something that he wrote a lot of poetry about because he had a lot of beautiful young women who he loved who died in his life. His mother died when he was 2. His beloved foster mother died of tuberculosis as well as his mother. And then his beloved Virginia, his wife, dies of tuberculosis. He watches this slow descent of her at only 24 years old. And so that for him is in fact a poetical topic. For us, examining ghost lore, there's a certain allure to the romanticized, beautiful, dead young woman. And we unpack that. So there's, in each of our sections, there is a introduction section that talks about, all right, here's how we might think about this concept of women being snipped at their potential, at their prime of their life, and their cord has been cut, their spiritual thread is gone. What might we romanticize about their ghost story afterwards? And we examine that, we unpack that a little bit, and then we tell some stories of young women whose lives were ended too soon. And we talk about those tragedies, and also talk about some resilience, because that's the thing about a ghost story. The ghost story lives on. Very often the ghost story will outlive any hopes and dreams that person living might have had. Somebody who might have wanted to be famous, then, well, she gets to be famous in this ghost story where we are telling her story. And there's something really powerful about us continuing to tell women's histories, especially in cases where, like in the case of Gertrude Treadwell, if she hadn't made those specific choices for the merchant's house and kept her house in the way that it wouldn't have been a museum, and then we wouldn't be still telling her story. And now she's a famous ghost. And she gets to live a much larger life than she would have in just a specific role of the 19th century when women really were discouraged from most professions. So we move on from Death and the Maiden to other types of things that have been lobbed at women through history. Our next section is witches. And I say this in quotes because FYI, the Salem witches were not, in fact, witches. So the Salem witch trials in the 1690s were persecuting people, and it wasn't just women, it was women and men who were killed in the Salem trials. they did not identify as witches. At no point were they engaging in what we would consider to be modern witchcraft. So that is a separate thing. Modern Salem has a lot of witchy stores and a lot of witchy practitioners now, but that was not what was happening in the 1690s. The 1690s was mob mentality that was picking on poor or ornery people that some of the people in power didn't like, and then they were seizing their property. So it was very much a power play in the 1690s that was exacerbated by the feeling like the devil was around every corner. And so it was hysteria. It was the power and influence of something just getting really, really, really out of hand. And it didn't get out of hand in other places. There were witch trials all around the country, and they just didn't really go places because most courts of law were like, yeah, no, you're just having a fight with your neighbor. They're not actually hexing you. So in a lot of cases, like in the case of New York would not allow spectral evidence. Literally, that's the term for it. They would not allow spectral evidence into court. So you couldn't just say the devil made me do it or the devil made that person do it, and that be admissible in court. So a lot of times the witch trials would sort of peter out that way and not actually lead to persecutions, let alone the amount of death that happened in Salem. That was just a particular situation. But that concept of labeling someone a witch has had historical alienating power. But in that, women have very much found, and people who are looking for alternative ways of spirituality have found an empowerment in the concept of the witch. And we're certainly here in a metaphysical bookshop where there's a great deal of power within the concept of reclaiming our inner magic. That is a beautiful thing. That wasn't in place in the Salem trials, but there are spirits and ghost stories that are told about that. And modern Salem is basically a practice and a bit of cognitive dissonance, because the police cars have a witch riding a broom on them, and it was the law that put these women and men to death back in the day. And so there's an interesting turn of now that's capitalizing on the concept of witchcraft. So it's quite a different space there, that we have to wrestle with these things about history, because also two people have to make a living, and Salem's become a tourist spot. And we don't begrudge anyone trying to make a living, but we have to do it with an understanding of history. We have to do it with respect. We have to realize that the victims of the Salem witch trials, they were people, and we need to respect their history and not conflate it with an empowerment of modern witchcraft. These are two separate things. So again, we try to unpack some of these things. I share a story of a witch story that was completely invented in Maine. Maine had no witch trials, but there is a witch's curse because there is a foot on this man's grave, and it totally looks like there's a foot dancing on a grave. So because there's this flaw in the stone that looks like a foot, people are like, that's gotta be a witch's curse. I mean, you look at it does really look like there's a foot over the name Buck, who's the guy who founded Bucksport in Maine. And it looks like maybe that is a thing. It really is just a flaw in the stone, but we want to put a story behind something that's weird on a grave. Like, that is like a human instinct to be like, there is something weird on a grave, and we're going to make a story about it. And even though there's a whole big thing right next to the grave that's like, none of this is true, but it's still the witch's curse of Bucksport, Maine shows up in all of these haunted history books, and none of it is founded. It's just this wild flaw in the stone. And it, like a game of telephone, the game of who the witch was and what was happening, it gets really wild. The foot was a disembodied foot. It was bleeding from the stone at one point. Stuff gets out of hand. It's sort of like playing a game of telephone. And when you do it with campfire ghost stories, stuff can get really exciting, but it can also mean that, like, all right, we have now veered completely into the preposterous, and somewhere in this, can we try to get back to actual real history? So we move on from Death and the Maiden to witches. Then we've got mothers and wives, because that is a role that women have been expected to perform through history, mothers and wives. So we talk about mothers and wives who have become ghosts, who are bucking some of those stereotypes, maybe who really in some ways had it all, who were a career woman and a mother. In the case of Ma Green, my favorite lady, Mary Becker Green was the first woman to get her steamboat pilot's license in 1892. And she piloted all of these steamships up and down the Ohio River. That's where I'm from, Cincinnati. And she loved living on her steamboats, and she gave birth on a steamboat and then went back to piloting it. Then she would go like sew the curtains for the guest rooms. So she was doing all these womanly things, the things that women are expected to do, like, deal with dishes and things like that. And then she would go pilot a boat and win a race in an actual steamboat race. So she was this total badass. And she still haunts the Delta Queen, the ship that she died upon. But she was a very fun lady. She loved dancing. She loved dancing the Virginia Reel. She was expert. But she did not want alcohol on her ship because she was adamantly against alcohol. So that people really must have loved Ma's company, because she was always selling tickets to her boats, but there was no booze on those boats. So she was just that good of a hostess. And so after she passed, they were like, okay, well, Ma's not around, so we're going to put a bar on the ship. And now Mary Becker Green had died in her stateroom. And so every now and then there would be calls from the stateroom. Every now and then, if there was something wrong with the ship, whoever was the captain would be awakened by a shove, by a grab, by a phone call, by something waking the captain up. Several times this happened when something on the ship was actually in danger. So Mary Becker Green was still looking out after her ship even after she had passed. And then they started to make plans for putting a bar into her ballroom. And as they made these plans, a barge crashes into the side of the Delta Queen right at where they were making the bar, and they dislodge the barge, and the name on the barge is the Mary B. Mary Becker Green. Did she stutter? She said no alcohol on her ships. And so here's a case in which we're like, all right, so here's Ma Green, and that was her name, was Ma Green, who's still haunting her ship. Mothers can be multitudes, and she's a great example of that. So, we talk about different ways in which women were working within those expected roles and where they stepped out from them. We also, of course, have to talk about bad girls, Jezebels, and killer women. Because, women can be murderers too. Women can be terrible just as much as anybody. So we talk about some of that, and we're not interested in rehabilitating the people who are legitimately have no business being rehabilitated. We don't whitewash any of that stuff. There's definitely some fascinating history in there, and Andrea did a great job with that whole section. And then my personal favorite section is part 5, which is Mad Women. And of course, Mad Women has to be in quotes, because again, that was something that was lobbied. That was something that was absolutely tossed at women through history. Stuff that was absolutely used as a cudgel towards women if they would not be believed, or if they wouldn't behave, or if they... I start the section with institutionalizing women in the 19th century was like a pastime, to the point where they had to create a law firm just to keep unlawful institutionalizations from happening. So this is something that has been a long part of women's history, of being believed, of trying to figure out where in the mental health capacity are we dealing with women? Are we believing them? Are we thinking that they're irrational beings? Are we thinking that that it's just all intuition and no rationale? All of these things have been part of the discussion of women in society since time immemorial. So we unpack some things in which women were said to be mad women who were not, in fact. Sarah Winchester, to be my favorite example. Sarah Winchester Mystery House, fantastic, 160 room mansion. It's weird, it's wild. It was built and built and built and built. And people said during her lifetime, here's this mad woman who must be pursued by the spirits of those killed by the Winchester rifle. Clearly, because who else would go and from their cushy life in Connecticut and inheriting to becoming one of the wealthiest women in the world when her husband and her father-in-law died, leaving all of the Winchester Repeating Arms Company money to her, and she had millions of dollars in the 1880s, so that's very, very wealthy. And she just packs up and goes west, and she starts building this endless mansion. Now, people said she was crazy then. It just kind of happened that she liked architecture, and she really kind of used the house like someone else would build a model train set. She just actualized. She did all of her designs herself. She was untrained, but her and William, her husband, who had passed away, who she grieved for the rest of her life, They had really bonded over loving architecture and loving plans and setting things up together. And so she just built the endless house because she had the money to do that, and she paid her workers twice the rate of anyone in California. And they loved her and she loved them, and they were a surrogate family, and she just gave them houses on her 160 acres. And it was just this kind of lovely sort of commune, and it was quirky, sure, in that this was this endless house, and it doesn't always make sense. And yes, it's like a Russian nesting doll of houses, and some things go up to nowhere. But part of that was because she was like, well, that didn't quite work, let's build around it. Okay. And it would have been, again, like a dollhouse, but just real life scale, because she had a lot of money and she could. And she got such hell for it during her life. So for me, going to this house, and yes, it is haunted, but it's not haunted in the way that people think. It's not haunted because she was mad. She was very generous and very kind, shy. She didn't like to go out in public. So people, again, told stories about somebody that didn't put themselves forward. She really was an introvert. And as a wealthy lady, people wanted to know what she was doing with her money. And they just didn't think that was a wise idea with her money. And people like to think that other people should be doing other things. And there was just a lot of opinions about her. But this perpetuated because the year after her passing, she didn't mention the house in her will. She didn't mention it to anybody. So she just let it go, and it was going to be torn down. It was assessed of no value because no one knew what to do with it. But this guy who ran an amusement park out in Niagara Falls was like, you know what? What's really popular out at my amusement park is the mystery house. And here's a ready-made mystery house that's real weird looking because it's all at angles. And then we can just say this crazy lady built this house, and that's what happened. They opened a haunted house, and so thusly the haunting of that house perpetuated in a very specific, very overdone, overblown, and completely false reality. But here's the thing about ghost lore. Ghost lore is very popular. It's profitable, and so in some ways, if they hadn't opened the house, we wouldn't probably still have the house. So there's sometimes the historical preservation angle needs to kind of be entwined with ghost lore, and sometimes that can be exaggerated, but there is sometimes a propensity to have that be part of the marketing. And again, I can't really blame the guy for being like, well, this is a really interesting thing that I don't want to get torn down. Let me use it. And now we, at least in terms of what I'm doing, and the house historian that's there at the house is trying to merge these things of, okay, here's the myths, and here's the real lady that lived in this house and that was beloved by her staff, and the staff still haunt the house. They show up. People are part of the tour because they're in, costume. But, and then folks will be like, oh yeah, so they're the guy in the boater hat, the straw hat. Yeah, so he's part of the house, right? And they're like, no, that's Clyde. He was here 100 years ago. He's one of the groundskeepers, and he just likes to check on things. People are like, oh, okay. And like, here he is in a picture from, 150 years ago. Okay. It's great. And it is absolutely haunted, but it's kind of haunted by love. And that doesn't necessarily sell as many tickets to like being haunted as in terror. So that in and of itself is kind of an interesting thing. So moving on from we've got just a couple sections here, and then I will move on to a lesson, and then we'll actually be thinking about questions, y'all. If you have questions, we'll move on from this into we're gonna 2 more sections. Can do a little psychic shielding discussion, and then we're gonna open to questions. So spinsters and widows is our next one. I had mentioned that with Gertrude Treadwell. Why are we so afraid of women alone? This is a question. This is a question we put to you, and we put to the ghosts here. The concept of women living on their own terms. This has been something that was historically quite questioned. So we examine that in our ghost lore here. And we end with frauds, fakes, and myth-making, because yes, frauds, fakes, and myth-making, there's a lot of stuff in the ghost business that is entirely made up. And so we're trying to just put some pieces together of what can we verify is true, what can we examine as to, well, why did that falsehood perpetuate? Sometimes it's just been about making money. Sometimes it's been because people were saying things as a rationale for why someone was doing what they were doing. And if in their life they didn't ever say otherwise, like in the fact of Sarah Winchester, she never said one way or another if she was a spiritualist or if she held seances or what she felt about the spirits of those killed by the Winchester rifle. She never said one way or another. So people put on their own explanations onto these things. So myth making happens. We as human beings love to tell stories. We are myth makers from the dawn of time. The first thing we were doing before we were writing anything down, we were telling stories. And also trying to make sense of the world, trying to make sense of ourselves in an existential way. So ghost stories are no different, because it's actually how we grapple with the concept of mortality. Ghost stories are just another way that we are sitting with those existential questions, and ghost lore can be a comfort for people. It can be a way you can work out things that scare you. We don't, as a society, know how to deal with mortality very well, more often than not. But ghost stories can provide a little bit of comfort, like, well, maybe there's something, maybe we do go on. Maybe there is energy that persists. That's certainly been the case for a lot of people who are turning to taking our ghost tours and wanting a little bit of reassurance in that regard, or just curious, because we as human beings are always going to be curious about the unknown. We're always going to want to know things that we don't know. And I'm sorry, I can't answer any questions about whether ghosts are real or what happens after death. That is above my pay grade. I don't know, but I love talking about ghosts. I love telling their stories. These are real people. They absolutely have their own stories to tell, and women's history has been very often shuttered. In a lot of cases, it was hard for us to find the complete aspect of some of these, because tracing down who these women really were is difficult. When you, in the 19th century, when you were married, your name would be entirely usurped by, you became Mrs. male name. And so sometimes finding the records of who these people were has been extremely difficult. So why sometimes you would only have the first name of a ghost, that somehow that was able to be kept onto, but the rest of who that person was and tracing them back almost becomes impossible. So again, the woman becomes a sort of cipher, and she becomes a metaphor for all kinds of different things, depending on the context that we have for her in these stories. And again, these were the ones that really called to us. These were the ones that we loved the most. We are going to be doing another book that's going to come out in 2025. It's called America's Most Gothic: Haunted History Stranger Than Fiction, in which case we talk about how tropes of Gothic literature factor into some real ghost stories. And because these real ghost stories fit the tropes of famous tales, they became this larger than life force of nature. Or here's some things where, wow, this is actually hidden history. And isn't this fascinating, because it could be like Edgar Allan Poe wrote it. So we're going to be exploring some of those ones. So if there's a ghost that you don't see in this, hold on, because we'll probably try to get to it next go round. We're not planning on stopping talking about ghosts anytime soon. So even though we could only get to a certain amount of women through this book, we're committed to continuing to uncover some of these stories. And so I want to touch, before I open up to any questions, I want to touch down just on a question that I get asked a lot. So when I was invited here by the wonderful Amityville Apothecary folks, part of the graphics was saying author talk in a workshop. And I want to offer a little bit of a workshop moment for all of you, because I'm asked this question all the time as a lecturer on the paranormal and as someone who works taking people around haunted spaces. And there have been jobs that I've worked inside haunted spaces. So I am often asked about the concept of attachments. Do you fear an attachment? Do you have them that follow you? The concept of a spectral entity of some kind that might follow us home because it knows that we were talking about them. Because I will say, being a little bit of an energy sensitive and I have had spectral experiences. I would not call myself a medium. I wouldn't go that far, but I'm energy sensitive. And I've definitely had uncanny things happen. So with all of that, I know that the spirit world is paying attention. We'll just put it that way. When I care about the spirit world, and I feel like I am part of what they have to say, and I usually channel that through my writing, more so than I would say there's any mediumship there. Whatever things I'm getting or whatever instincts I'm having, I'll usually try to put it in my writing. Or into my discussions with my guests on my tours about ghost lore in general. So I'm not necessarily afraid of attachments, because I think for me it's just about boundaries. So we are We are energy beings, all right? So this is going to get a little woo, and I assume that if you're coming to this feed, you're okay with a little woo, so we're good here. So, this is not the range of us. We are beyond this mortal coil. So we are beyond this. This is our physical form, but our energies field is around us. So anytime that I feel like I'm in a negative space, what I will do is I will kind of tap in to what I feel is my energy source, not inside of myself, because you don't want to deplete from your center. You don't want to deplete from your core. So for me, I personally do this in terms of the elements. I am very much a water and an air creature. I think you can tell from how much I gesture that I'm a real air creature. So I'm like just a few hours into Cancer from Gemini. So like it all makes sense now, right? Yeah. So I consider pulling energy down from the heavens and down from this celestial unknown, which is up there and super cool. And in my cosmology, that's full of love. So I pull that energy down, and then I will spread it out from me, thinking like a mushroom cloud, thinking like concentric circles, a little bit of a burst. If you're at the goth club and you're really into it, it's like your circle of fire, right? We all know the circle of fire. You remember your club days, circle of fire. This is your space, don't get in my space. Whether it's a creepy dude or whether it's a spectral entity, whatever. This is my circle of fire. So you are extending your circle of fire. Yes. Oh, I really love to go to a goth club and dance with y'all right now. But in the meantime, we're going to talk about psychic shielding. So this is what this is. So you're pulling energy down. You're snapping it out from your person. Any of the tendrils of negative energy. And this works for human beings too. Let's just put this down, because human beings too will have their own negative energy that's coming at you. So the more that you can get into your own personal power center. Now, for other people, they're going to be very talismanic about it. It might be, touching on to something like, obviously you see I've got some stones around my wrist, some that I got here at Amityville Apothecary because I really love obsidian, and I had given some to friends and needed to replenish. Sometimes it's a touchstone. And that will be a source of power. And from that, you can then say, okay, you're bursting that energy out from you, just like you're flicking off something that you don't want to have on you. And then again, this is porous. So you're going to have to do that maybe a few times if you're feeling a little off. If you're in a space where the energy isn't feeling right to you. Now, here's the thing. I think that all people have an ability to have their sixth sense. Our five senses are finite, and all of us have different levels of our five senses. Some people have really great hearing, maybe not as good eyesight, maybe not as good smell or taste, but they're going to be able to really be hypersensitive to textures. All of that goes for the sixth sense too. We're going to be aware of that on some kind of level. Sometimes, again, for folks who are also valid, because you might just not want to be on that spectrum. You might not want to be on that resonance, and that's totally cool. For that energy, that again, we're all made of energy. We're all made of a little electrical impulses. That's all happening, firing up in our brains. We're all beings of energy that is working all the time. So from this, extending that outwards, and then just knowing that you don't stop here, and the stuff that's exterior, you're not going to be able to create a wall, but you are going to be able to create a little bit of distance. And I do think that when we get overwhelmed as people, we all get overwhelmed. You can think of that psychic shielding as a way to just try to get back to calm, try to get back to focused, especially, you can probably tell I get a little ADHD, a shocker. So I will sometimes do that just to kind of get right with, wait, now what was I doing? So in these moments, we can be doing this kind of psychic shielding and just centering and extending out to refocus in on ourselves and on a positive energy, whether that's in a haunted space or whether that is in just our everyday lives. And so when people ask me, are you worried about things following you home? Are you worried about attachments? Are you worried about being in the heaviness of a haunted space? I'll let that affect me, because if I'm in a place where a tragedy has occurred, I want to feel the heaviness, because then I am honoring the tragedies and the traumas that happened there. I'm not interested in just walking right over that and not acknowledging the fact that this is a historical site that has resonance and that has pain in it. History is complicated. It is full of death and misery, but it's also full of wonder and excitement and new things and new possibilities. So we have to hold that complicated space for ourselves. We have to live in that complicated space, and be willing to feel all those things. But if it overwhelms you to a point where it's making you ill, I gotta say, 2 weekends ago, I was in Gettysburg at the battlefield in Gettysburg, and you've got tens and tens of thousands and thousands and thousands and thousands of lives lost in that particular battle, which was such a confluence of so many forces that were coming to bear on this one little town. And the spectral energy there is so heavy. It's so heavy and it's so intense. And the minute that I walked into my room in a very haunted inn, I got immediately seasick, literally seasick, like I was on a ship and I was motion sick. And so I just had to do exactly what I'm telling you. I had to just kind of center myself and put my energy forward, reground myself, really feel my feet on the ground. And that ground is also haunted ground. So that I had to keep doing that, and keep kind of just checking in with myself, and also having a conversation with the energy around me, saying, I respect how powerful and impactful it is there. It's not a place I say go into lightly, because the weight of that history is heavy. And there is a lot of loss, and it is a very, very haunted place. So those are the types of things that you want to guard against. I got a migraine driving into that town. I got a really bad migraine. Actually, I had to pull a car over, and I had to massage the back of my skull, because that's where, when I get really overwhelmed, it will all focus right back on here. And so I just had to kind of say, okay, let's refocus. And I had to be open, and I sort of had a little conversation with the spirit world. I was like, I understand all of you. I know, I care about you in a positive way. If anything is negative, I don't mess with that. We're not going to have that. You have to draw lines. You just sort of draw boundaries with yourself and with the spirit world, just like you would somebody living. If something is affecting you, if there's a ghost in your house and it is startling you, you have every right to say, hi, stop. Because you should, because you have sort of living privilege in that regard. Like their timeline is not yours. You are living in this moment. This is your place. So you get to say, this is my place, and you do not get to startle me. So that was the deal. I was like, hi, I know all y'all are around in mass. Just don't startle me. And they kept their word. And so that's my boundary. All of us can have those boundaries. You should have boundaries in all kinds of ways. So that's my sort of spirit world PSA for your boundaries. And so that's my little workshop part of this. And I want to make sure that, because I could just keep talking about this forever, but we don't have forever. So, I mean, not in this form. We have forever here in the pages of this book. So if anybody does have questions, we're going to let our wonderful Amityville staff help filter some questions for me. What do we got?
Vinny asked, have you had any experience, during your experience, have there been any spirits on your tours that have not wanted to be disturbed at all?
I have not had like Gertrude has not closed the door on me, as it were. I haven't had anybody that's or I haven't had any experiences that I was actively pushed out of. And maybe that's because most of the spaces know that I'm really a fan of a lot of the stories. I will say, though, that 14 West 10th Street, which is one of Manhattan's most haunted houses, that energy there is very, very negative. And lots of very, very difficult things happened there. And I don't want to get too much into detail here because it is a very, very sensitive topic. There was a child that was murdered in that house, and it has just a very, very negative energy there. So because of that, I don't like the energy of that house. It knows it. So there's like a push, and I can't breathe very easily when I'm standing in front of that house. But I still think it's important to talk about. There's a woman, Jan Bryant Bartell, who wrote a whole book about her experiences living in that house. And I think that her experiences are valid, even though she wasn't really believed during her lifetime. And her manuscript about that house came out posthumously. So for me, it's important to tell Jan's story, to say to her, I believe you, Jan. And I believe what you went through. And you were writing about the toxicity of this house long before there was murders committed inside of it. So this was sort of, she sort of was a canary in the coal mine. So in that regard, I've definitely had a pushing sense, absolutely. And in that, I have to reckon with that. And I always tell my guests, I'm like, if you see me getting a little bit short of breath or whatever, it's just, this is what happens with the energy of this house for me. And then I'll also take them next door and have them shake it off. Like, I don't leave end of the tour right there, because I think it's important to just kind of have a reset of that energy. And again, and maybe it's just me thinking about how sad it is of the loss of life there. And it might just be, our minds are really, really powerful. So sometimes there is very much just a reasonable explanation that doesn't necessarily have to be spectral about why you want to kind of just reset and reframe my ghost tours. So I was leading folks past. Again, this is Edgar Allan Poe. And Edgar Allan Poe is my literary boyfriend. I love him very much. And so I was standing out on the stoop of 116 Waverly Place, which is where Edgar Allan Poe wrote where he read The Raven aloud for the first time. So The Raven, the most famous of Poe's poems, he read it aloud to a group that was like, it was a sort of an author's salon. And in the 19th century, this was like, all of the New York's great poets and writers would sometimes gather at this particular salon at 116 Waverly Place. And so I'm standing on the stoop and I'm talking about how much I love Edgar Allan Poe and how incredible it would have been to have been listening to The Raven for the first time. What I would give to have been in this moment. And as I'm standing waxing rhapsodic about my literary boyfriend, a woman in my group takes a picture, and it was a digital camera photo. And so that little red light went on that happens in digital cameras to sort of offset the red of original print photos. You remember those? The red light went on, and there's 2 granite columns on either side of me, and they're polished and they're shiny. So the red light goes on, and there's this sphere of red light here, and I hear the shutter click, but the flash does not go on. The flash does not go off. It's just the shutter click and that red light. And then she turns the viewfinder around to look at the picture, and she screams. And I stop, because if someone screams on your ghost tour, you should probably stop what you're doing. And so I say, do you want to share with the class? Are you okay? A, are you okay? B, what are you seeing? And she gathers everyone around to her camera, and there's me in the center in a ridiculous pose. And there in that red light is Edgar Allan Poe's face. He's got a very distinct look. He's a distinct looking guy. And it is his shadows, his facial hair, the little line of his cravat in sort of a human scale. And I had this tiny pendant with his picture on, and the folks are looking at the pendant, and they're looking at this face, and they're seeing that this is like the same face, but it wasn't like there was a line that was somehow transporting that image onto the thing. There was no way that she could have manipulated this photo in the moment. And I'm like, everyone's seeing this, right? Like, everyone is seeing what I'm seeing, and everyone's tracking this. And in that moment, I didn't know what else to say, so I just said, my love has come for me. Because, I was like, and so and honestly, Edgar Allan Poe, he did have a little bit of an ego on him, and I know that he liked it when people liked his work. And so I know he liked it when people were talking nice about him. So I have to think that, he just wanted to show up for the praise and the attention. I mean, who wouldn't? I'm an author too. I love it when people give us good reviews. So, with that, and so I then said to this woman, I was like, you have to give me this picture, because this is now like job insurance. I had summoned Edgar Allan Poe on my tour. I felt really cool. And so the tour wasn't done. I still had a bunch more stops to do. So I gather my wits about me and then go around, give the rest of the tour. And then she goes through the photos by the end just to double check what she had taken pictures of. And that photo that all of us saw wasn't there. Sometimes, ghosts can be kind of spooky and annoying about that, because they'll be like, yeah, you saw a thing, but then you're not going to be able to prove a thing. You saw a thing, and then we're just be like, no, sorry. You don't get to have that. You had it for a second, but then it's just going to slip away, ephemeral. So anyway, thanks for that question. Any other questions?
Well, our customer Rye said, I love Edgar Allan Poe. His writings kind of opened the door to being a witch for me when I was little.
Yes. I mean, they opened the door for me as someone who wanted to be a writer, and I wanted to write 19th century prose and, all of this stuff for me. There's a reason why we talk about him a lot. So Edgar Allan Poe did live in New York City, and so on some of our tours, we talk about some of the places that Poe lived. And so I know that we're definitely doing a little celebration on his birthday on January 19th. We'll probably try to do it virtually because who wants to walk the streets of New York City in January? Nobody.
That's the next question.
yeah.
Beth asked, are the addresses of the tours in New York City listed in your book?
And in terms of where to take a tour, in terms of the tours that we lead, everything is on the Burrs of the Dead website. In terms of the addresses that we are talking about, the locations that we're talking about, all of those are either listed as an address or as listed as a museum. So many of the places that we talk about that have ghost lore are actual museums that you can go and you can visit. There are some residential addresses. Do not go to those residential addresses. Do not try to get into those residential addresses. That is just not good behavior. And that these are people's houses. We are very careful about these things. Now there've been, in terms of, West 10th Street and in terms of other spaces, there's been extensive things written about them through the years. We are hardly the only ones. Again, Spindrift was written by Jane Bryant Bartell. She writes an entire book about her experiences in 16 West 10th Street and 14 West 10th Street. But again, these are residential addresses. So like with everything, have respect, because these are not tourist attractions and there was very dark history that happened there. But you will find them in the local ghost lore and ghost books about New York City. That will come up. The museums, please visit the museum. Please visit the Morris Jamel Mansion uptown. Please visit the Merchant's House Museum. The museums are fantastic because you can really interact with the history. The ghost lore is this fun additional aspect of it, but they do need your help and they do need your patronage, because historic houses of any kind is just, it's very hard to upkeep. So so if there's and if folks do have questions, you can find Andrea and I online. We're on all the social medias, but in terms of taking a Burrs of the Dead tour, go to burrsofthedead.com and you will see all the various tours that we offer. We have a bunch of different guides. I am done giving tours for the rest of the year because I am on book deadline. I have 2 books due by February and they are not written yet. So I'm going to hibernate. So you will not get me as a tour guide, but I'll be giving tours next October, and I'll be doing some things with Andrea over the course of the next couple of months. So if you are curious about some of the events that she and I are doing event-based, or in some cases virtual-based, please sign up for the Burrs of the Dead mailing list. She doesn't spam you, we promise. You don't get emails all the time, just about what is next and what is happening. And there's lots of cool tours around all the boroughs, and it's really fun. And in terms of the other addresses around the nation, it's very clear in the book where these places are. And a lot of them, a great deal of them are visitable. So what else?
Meg is asking if there's any spooky history that you're aware of regarding the cloisters, which is funny.
We were just talking about the cloisters. That because the cloisters was constructed, it was not really a place that was lived in the same way that like haunted houses have a perpetuating ability. That particular area and building, it has an energy, certainly. It has a spectral energy, but it's not been something that has manifested into a specific ghost lore, because it was constructed as a museum. It was constructed as an art gallery, essentially. We were just talking about how, the Rockefellers bought a whole swath of land across the way from the cloisters in New Jersey, so you could see an unbroken, pristine landscape to give you the sense that you traveled back in time. And so because of that, I think people feel that it is haunted, because you have this place that's out of time. And there is something we said. There's something called place memory, and that's sort of the concept of like a psychic imprint. And I think in some ways, because it is this place where you really are kind of transported into a medieval setting, you can kind of feel like it's time traveling with you. So I think in that ways, it has it's part of the conversation of haunted spaces in that regard, because of the effect that it has on the people that visit. What else?
I know earlier you were saying that Central Park is your favorite place to talk about. So do you want to just share a few little snippets about why? About why
Central Park? So I do a tour, and I only offer it a couple times a year. I do a tour called The Magic and Mysticism of Central Park. Ooh. And it's all about the transcendentalist nature of Central Park. Now, Central Park in and of itself isn't particularly haunted. There are a couple of stories, but they're pretty thin. What is haunted is some of the buildings around Central Park. So we start at the Dakota Building, and the Dakota building is very haunted. That's a specific place that has a very strong place memory, and it's one of my favorite stories because it will revert to its 19th century form. The interior apartments of the Dakota building, which is it was one of the first really large scale apartment buildings in New York City, and finished by 1888. So it was being built during the mid 1880s, and and famous people have lived there through the years, and unfortunately it is the address right out front of which John Lennon had been shot. And so there's some fraught history with all of this, but it really is a building that retains its 19th century character. Some people have reported when they'll turn around in their renovated apartment, they'll turn around and there will be a chandelier where the chandelier had been taken out a long time ago. Wood paneled walls where it had been redone since then. Staircases that used to be there that have been taken out through the years. So it will almost revert to its original form sometimes. It almost has a certain sentience to it is a building of its era, despite the changes to it, which I think is particularly fascinating. So in terms of Central Park itself, I think it's very important to understand the power of the Transcendentalist movement, which was happening in the 1830s, right around the same time as the garden-style cemetery movement was happening, creating beautiful places where you could walk along landscaped, gorgeous settings in a graveyard, rather than it being just close and not atmospheric. So with the same thing with the Transcendentalist movement, the concept was getting away from flawed human institutions. At that point, it was a pushback against the church. So the poets that were working within the Transcendentalist movement were kind of making a critique against politicians of the age and the divinity schools of the age, which they didn't feel were losing the core of what spirituality should be. For the Transcendentalists, it was, you know what? Just take a walk. Literally, the Transcendentalists were like, would you touch grass? Would you literally please do this? Because you're all getting caught up in all of these various things, and you just need to go and take a walk, appreciate a tree, and that is God, and then you'll get right with yourself and the divine. That's me. This is me paraphrasing. Like the actual poets, the Transcendentalists would be like, hanging their head right now. But essentially, so that really is leading mysticism, the angle of the human relationship with nature, that was leading a lot of why Central Park was formed the way it was, with these meandering paths to these little spots where you open up almost into these little chapel spaces along the way, and you turn around and no two spaces within Central Park is the same. And it's meant to disorient you, and it's meant to take you away from the hustle and the bustle of the city. And it was made as a public good, and it was made as a public good for all classes. It was not gated off. It was not only for the rich. It was a truly egalitarian park in its concept. And the reason why it is central, so that everyone had as possible, as easy of an access to try to get to it as possible. And so that it has a lot of really interesting intersections with the mysticism movement, because it was being built from the 1840s through the 1860s. And in that time period, a lot of interest in mysticism was really, really rampant. And so when I take people through, I talk about these different ways in which the spiritualist movement and seances and trying to talk to the dead and trying to use that as a way to deal with grief. Central Park was being finished during the Civil War. New York, so going back, talking about Gettysburg again, New York lost more soldiers than any other state in the Union Army. And so New York was grieving very much. And so Central Park became a place that was sort of a foci of people trying to kind of like process the heavy news of their time. And it really was meant as that public health and that public respite. And the Bethesda Terrace with that beautiful angel at the center of that fountain, that became a real focal point of almost became its own sort of memorial that was there. It was sort of very much part and parcel of all of that. So that particularly is a very, very spiritual place. So that's just a few things about Central Park. Again, please do sign up for Birds of the Dead mailing list, because then you can figure out when. There's probably only going to be 2 times next year that I will lead the tour, because it is a very specific niche angle on this. So for any mystics out there, I got you. So again, we'll be doing that at some point in the nicer, warmer months. What else?
that's it.
I think we're good. Yeah.
This is so.
Thank you so much. So I appreciate all of you. I am Leanna Renée Hieber at Instagram. So please do follow me on Instagram as well. And please
Leanna
get a
signed
copy.
all of her books,
Yeah.
so they're available on our website. We'll put a link up there. So
They're all signed here.
Yeah.
So and please get them from this wonderful shop. Please support the shop.
Yeah, we'll definitely put the link. Thank you so much for coming and giving us this chat. It actually reminded me of. Did you ever have a chance to take Dr. Carol Levin's class up at New Paltz?
No, I know how much you loved it.
So she taught a class called Saints, Witches, and Man-Women.
Oh my gosh.
It's like you.
It's literally
it's
like
this. It's literally this. And it was really the lens through which we understand how women are portrayed through lore. And that's really what we're talking about here.
This is an extension of that.
Amazing.
Absolutely.
This is
Thank
so
you
much
so
fun.
much.
Thank you.
for coming
Thanks,
today.
everyone.
Thanks for watching. And or watching on the replay.
Yes.
Bye.
Yes.
Good night.
Happy haunting.